this study is an analysis of the baseline data from a project called UPAVAN. And UPAVAN stands for Upscaling Participatory Action and Learning, and videos for agriculture and nutrition, which aims to improve maternal and child nutrition outcomes in rural Odisha, India. So the trial compares 3 variants of nutrition-sensitive agriculture extension intervention. It's a multi-organizational project, and I just wanted to show you a picture of some of my colleagues, the team, as I'm presenting today on behalf of them. And I also wanted to pay some acknowledgements to the data collectors also, because they are out in the field today working really hard on collecting the end-line data for the trial. So on to the motivation behind the research. So, it is well known that in India, rural poor women face great but heterogeneous disadvantage in several nutrition-related domains. And this is especially concerning for the success of nutrition-sensitive agricultural interventions, as we know that gender roles are central to several activities along the agriculture nutrition pathway, including activities such as intra-household food allocation and, of course, women's own nutritional status, which has implications for intergenerational malnutrition. Consequently, systematic reviews evidence that if nutrition-sensitive agricultural interventions have a focus on women's status and women's empowerment, they will yield greater outcomes. And this stems from the hypothesis that if women have more power, they will allocate more resources to the household, of which will be allocated for nutrition. So despite a proliferation of research on the linkages between women's empowerment and nutrition, results show largely heterogeneous outcomes so far. But if we can better understand these linkages between empowerment and nutrition, we can create synergies between the Global Sustainable Development Goals on zero hunger and gender equity, and find ways to simultaneously address these challenges. So, thinking about some of the reasons why we have this variation in the research so far, we think one of these reasons might be due to the oversimplified conceptualization of empowerment. So as demonstrated in the diagram just here and adapted from Kabir's framework, empowerment is a function of 3 interconnected domains with intermediate pathways, these domains being resources, agency, and achievements. Now, different pathways may strengthen or reduce the effect of one domain on another. So a lot of the research so far has either studied one or more domain individually or aggravated them into a single index. And where we see mixed evidence on the effect of equity in agricultural resources on food security, very few studies show evidence of equity in resources actually on nutrition outcomes. So why might this be? So it's thought that this might be a result of gender inequalities occurring further down the value chain in the decision-making process. But what about men? So important and often overlooked aspect in so a lot of the empirical evidence to date actually overlooks the fact that empowerment is relational and it is gendered. And if we assume that power is a zero-sum game between men and women, power is actually a function of the relative levels of power between the household members. And actually looking at absolute levels of power among women might not be sufficient. So this brings us to our research objectives. So the primary research question is the relationship between inequity in agricultural resources and maternal nutrition outcomes mediated by inequities in decision-making? And as we ask this question, we focus on the relative inequalities between men and women at each stage of the empowerment process. So as I mentioned, this study uses the baseline data from UPAVAN. So UPAVAN is a 4-arm cluster randomized control trial aiming to improve maternal and child nutrition. And the trial builds upon Digital Green's successes of using videos as agriculture extension platforms and combines this with different variants of nutrition information. And in one arm, we also have women's participatory learning and action meetings. So we have several additional outcomes on top of improving maternal and child dietary diversity, such as reducing women's workload and improving equity in agriculture. And both the baseline and endline data is collected via a multi-purpose household survey, which collects comprehensive information on women's empowerment, cost incurred in agriculture, and of course anthropometry and dietary diversity. Dietary diversity is captured via 24-hour recall and aggregated into a minimum dietary diversity score, which is out of 10 food groups. So this study is informed by an a priori developed DAG, which is strategically underpinned by Kabir's framework of the empowerment process. And the DAG basically shows the causal pathways by which gender inequalities in agriculture are hypothesized to affect nutrition outcomes. And it also informed of the a priori confounders, which we adjusted for in the analysis. So we used a preliminary analysis of standard multivariate regression before following this with a mediation analysis. And if the 3 different multivariate regression analyses show a significant effect, we would then assume some evidence of mediation is going on. So the aim of the mediation analysis itself is to quantify how much of the effect of the exposure is acting through the pathway of the mediators. So we analyze the direct effects of gender inequities in agriculture resources, being land and livestock ownership, on the nutrition outcomes, and then the indirect effects that are mediated through women's agency, which is defined as decision equity here, and total value of agriculture production. Okay, so briefly on the descriptive statistics, I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but these really highlight our rationale for wanting to improve dietary diversity and women's BMI in this population group. So we can see the mean dietary diversity score is a staggering low 3.7 out of 10. And we also see that almost 45% of the women in our sample have a BMI of below 18.5. So I will touch upon how the equity variables were generated. So all of them use the same principle, whereby we had on the numerator women's reported ownership of land for the land ownership equity score, and on the denominator we have men plus women's reported ownership. And this gives us a score between 0 and 1, with 1 being pro-women and 0 being pro-men. And then the same principle for value of women's reported livestock, so women on the numerator and men plus women reported livestock ownership on the denominator. And then for decision-making equity, we have the numerator as the number of areas in which women input into all or most decisions, areas including things such as food production for household consumption, cash crop farming, and then men plus women on the denominator. And from the distribution in the histogram, we can see that our decision equity score is extremely pro-male in this sample. So on to the regression analysis, the preliminary regression analysis, where we have maternal BMI as the outcome. So what we have here on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the association between the exposure and the mediator. And then on the right, we have the association between the mediator and the outcome adjusting for the exposure. And across the middle, we have the total effect. So exposure on the outcome, just adjusting for the confounders. And for mediation to be going on, we would expect to see a significant effect for each of these regression analyses. And straight away, we can see that we don't actually have an association between equity in agriculture resources and maternal BMI. So we would also assume that there is no mediation, which we then followed through and confirmed with the mediation analysis. And we can see the average causal mediation effect, or the indirect effect here. The coefficients are almost 0 and not significant. So moving on to when we have maternal dietary diversity as the outcome, the total effects across the middle is significant. So we can see that equity in land and livestock ownership is associated with improvements in maternal dietary diversity. But then when we look to the results on the left-hand side first, we see that we only have equity in value of livestock owned being associated with the media of equity in decision-making. But then when we look at that mediator and its association with the outcome, whilst adjusting for that exposure, we see that that is not significant. And that implies that we, again, probably do not have any evidence of mediation here either. Again, we ran the mediation analysis to confirm whether or not there was any mediation, and again, we can see the direct effect, the coefficients are pretty much exactly the same as the total effects, and the average causal mediation effect coefficients are almost zero. So, taking this together, we show that women's empowerment in agriculture for some variables, such as equity in land and livestock ownership, is associated with maternal dietary diversity, but not with BMI. We also show that there is no evidence that the relationship between livestock equity and land equity and maternal dietary diversity and BMI is mediated by equity in the decision-making or production value. So although we haven't found any association here, it does not necessarily mean that there is not a relationship going on. And it might just be that we have not adequately collected these decision-making equity and land equity, etc., because these, and it might be that these tools are actually a little bit too blunt to capture what is actually a rather complex concept. And if we think about how we are going about capturing these tools, especially in these multi-purpose household surveys, people are sitting for a long time. They're answering a lot of questions. They may or may not be alone. And one very important aspect is that it might be that our respondents are not necessarily giving their perception of what ownership is, but rather more what they think the correct answer may be, i.e. what they think the household head might be wanting them to say. So these tools are doing their very best to capture what is a very complex idea, but it may just be that they're not quite refined enough. And as an agriculture and nutrition community, this may be something that we need to look into. Going back to why we see no association with BMI. Of course, it's very important for us to remember that BMI is a very proxy for nutrition status, and it doesn't tell us about lean muscle mass and adipose tissue and just body composition overall. And especially in the Indian context, this is something that we are particularly interested in. So a final point, which is a little bit outside the scope of this study, and touching upon what Dr. Zanello spoke about, is why do we not see an association with BMI, but we do with dietary diversity? And we might want to think about, is greater engagement in women in agriculture actually resulting to an increased workload and an increased energy expenditure? And in order for women to diversify their crops and consequent to a more diverse diet, is the increased workload resulting in more energy that the greater dietary diversity does not compensate for? So that's just something that might want to be considered when making nutrition-sensitive agriculture interventions that focus on engaging women more. So I just want to finalize with some of the current activities of the UPAVAN trial. So the trial results are coming up, which, well, the end line should end in about January time. And the trial results will be evaluating the impact of the 3 arms of the trial on maternal and child nutrition outcomes, with each arm being compared to the control. We just use the baseline to adjust for. Other outcomes that will be analysed include production diversity, net value of agricultural production, and also to test the pathways through which the proposed interventions may improve maternal and child nutrition outcomes. There is also an economic analysis, which is a societal perspective on cost effectiveness, and which was done in the summer, the process evaluation, which will assess the quality of implementation and the mechanisms behind the intervention effect. So, yeah. Thank you for having me.